What's good, YouTube? My name's Connor, and this is Gaimon's Island, a One Piece YouTube channel that's going to be packed full of theories and other One Piece content you'll love, so be sure to let me know what you think with a like, and subscribe to keep your treasure boxes filled and safe from bandits. So what do Zoro, the Going Merry, the Ancient Weapons, and Sulong Form all have in common? Question might seem kind of strange at first, but it really isn't. They all can be explained by my theory about a hidden power system in One Piece, known as Soul Power. Not so weird, right? But before I can establish how soul power ties into these other topics, I need a foundation. So first, we're going to need to establish the three elements that make up any given character in One Piece. Number one, the first element's going to be their body. That's the physical husk that's going to contain the other two elements. It's also trainable, right? You can do strength training. If you're in the Marines, you can know Roku Shiki, or if you just get there by other results like Sanji or Luffy, you get it. It's powers that are due to the physicality of the character. The second point is the shadow. The shadow is known as the second soul, which we learn about in Thriller Bark. This is going to be the wrapper that envelops the body. It gives it shape, like that time when Moria turned Luffy, when he was in Oars' body, into a giant ball. It gives them their shape. It even stores things like the physical strength and martial arts that somebody once had, like when Luffy was given that one shadow. Then he could just chop that tree up with a sword when he never used a sword before. So, in the third topic, which is the main topic of my theory, is going to be the soul. That's responsible for a character's lifespan, their emotions, and is at its core the essence of who a person is. And if you'd like more on these three elements, there's plenty of videos on YouTube about this topic. But let's move on to something more fun. Let's talk about Zoro and how he augments his haki with soul power, right? Zoro's actually had plenty of screen time using soul power. And the best place to start, though, is at the beginning, right? With this fight against Mr. One in Alabasta, where Zoro has his breath, or I think in the anime it's rhythm of all things moment. I'm going to say breath, though. The first moment where Zoro really taps into this power system. In this scene, Zoro's losing his fight to Mr. One because he can't cut steel. Mr. One, or Das Bones, continues to put the pressure on Zoro to the point where Zoro is about to die and feels like he's, quote, standing at the gates of Hades, unquote. Here he can only hear his own heart beating, but for some reason, he can see everything around him breathing. He then remembers a lesson from his master about cutting nothing, but by being able to cut nothing, he also learns how to cut anything, and then he speed blitzes Mr. One immediately, winning the fight. So let's break this down a little bit. Zoro's about to die, very important detail, and while he's on the edge between life and death, he learns to see the breath of all things, gifting him with the power to cut steel. What I believe is happening here is that Zoro learns that everything has its own spiritual frequency, or breath. Since Zoro's between the lands of the living and dead, he's able to see the breathing of Mr. One's steel. Zoro then changes the frequency of his own sword, and with that is able to cut Mr. One. But if you don't believe me, let's look at another example. Zoro's fight with Monet and Punk Hazard. In this fight, we see Zoro isn't necessarily on the brink of death, but at this point, he's trained with Mihawk, Perona, and the Humandrels, which is a very important detail I'll cover later, and many fights have happened at this point in the series. When Zoro decides to end things, he freezes time, and Monet exclaims, "I can't move," much like when Zoro met the Grim Reaper in Wano. Again, very important, I'll talk about that later. And there's even a special sound effect here that we hear that isn't hockey related. We then see Zoro cut Monet directly down the middle, but she's not dead. Monet has a Logia Devil Fruit, and as we know, you can't hit a Logia user without hockey, right? Well, this is because Logia Devil Fruit users lose their physical body in exchange for making it into whatever element the fruit represents, and are able to manipulate themselves using their soul. This is why Green Bull was able to come back to life after being burned to the ground by Momo, because his soul hadn't been defeated. But back to the fight. Tashigi, who was watching the fight, confirms for us that no hockey was used, and shortly after, we see that Monet can't reform no matter how hard she tries. This is because Zoro cut her soul directly using the breath of all things, but in a more advanced application, where he cuts nothing physical at least. So far what we know from these first two examples is that Zoro can both see the breath or spiritual frequency of the soul of everything around him, and affect that breath consciously as he does before he strikes the sword. One more thing we learn is that the soul can be attacked directly without any damage being taken by the physical body. These principles make up one portion of how Zoro utilizes soul power in his fighting style, but there's a much bigger and haunting implication to this ability to change the soul's frequency. Cut to Zoro and his duel with Kaku, the Toys R Us mascot from the CP9 who uses 4-sword style. And real quick, just take a listen to the sound effect that's used here when Zoro activates Asura, accidentally for the first time. Now, I don't know about you, but that didn't really sound like Haki to me. In fact, it sounded a lot like the sound his sword made when he cut Monet. At this point in the story, Haki wasn't overtly used much, leaving Zoro with his swordsmanship skills and his promises to Kuina and Luffy. But right at the end of the fight, Zoro pulls out an insane Uno reverse card and seems to suddenly summon a demon, instantly taking the fight again. One key element in this moment to remember is that Zoro was about to die. However, the main difference this time around is that Zoro summons Asura using the phrase demon aura. Aura being defined by Merriam-Webster as a distinctive atmosphere surrounding a given source, or an energy field that is held to emanate from a living thing. We see this aura field open up when Asura is activated, turning everything around Zoro pitch black. Zoro is then given 4 more arms and 2 more heads. Now, Kaku also sees the actual incarnation of Asura and identifies it as a demon god. So, what does this mean? We see Zoro's body change physically, we see a demon aura field around him, and we see Zoro completely nullify Kaku's attack, turning the water vapor in the Tempest Kick Slash into mist. Almost like an intro to Brook's ice attacks, said to be as cold as the land of the dead. What I believe happened here is that Zoro changed his own soul's frequency without realizing it, due to his emotions over his hurting crewmates and must win no matter what attitude, into that of the demon god Asura. As an aside, I want to mention that this may be what has cursed his Sandai Katetsu, and that Zoro simply drew that out of his sword. But anyways, this channeling ability is an advanced application of his Breath of All Things technique, in that he can call upon a demon, offering his body and soul to merge temporarily while Zoro is close to death. In Wano, we see this again when Zoro whips out Asura against Kaido. Then before we get too deep into it, take a listen to the sound effect that Zoro's sword makes as he activates Asura against Kaido. Now, we're well past the time skip in One Piece, and Haki is a mainstay in One Piece at this point, and that was not a Haki sound effect. Not at all. And also notice the switching that happens between Oden and Zoro in Kaido's mind. He's felt Oden's aura before, so he's feeling it again now. Hey, Kaido! Oh, there's the Haki. Take a look at this scene here where Zoro powers up his Asura. He's surrounded by this purple miasma that explodes into yellow flames, forming the actual Asura. And behind him, we can see a summoning sign, but what we don't see is black lightning that's indicative of that Conqueror's Haki. This is very important. Now, what a lot of people will point to here in this scene is when Kaido exclaims that Zoro can use this color of the Supreme King too. Now, it's entirely possible that he did use some Conqueror's Haki here, because we know Zoro can from a lot of other examples in the series, but the big player here is obviously Asura. See that because when Asura deactivates, we have this little scene where Zoro's sword has this yellow spark that trails down through it and then leaves the sword. And that's never happened with any of the examples of Haki and from any of the Haki masters we've seen so far. And even further, Zoro has no idea what Kaido's talking about. Zoro is a swordsman who practices his craft all day, every day. He knows what his attacks are going to do, and he has a good idea of what he's doing. So why would he not know what Kaido's even talking about here, when he's definitely used Conqueror's Haki before? 2 different times when they're raiding Onigashima. Watch these 2 clips here and listen to the sound effects that are used. They're nothing like what he does with Asura. I think the biggest thing to pay attention to in those 2 scenes is that Zoro uses his Haki pretty masterfully there. The first time around, he doesn't even knock the guy out, he just subdues him. And then later on, when he has to knock out a group who's about to jump him, he knocks them all out. But he does it in a way that doesn't completely knock everybody else out in the area, just like Luffy and Fishman Island. So what do all these different scenes, when they're brought together, what do they mean? What does that mean for Zoro's character? Well, we know Zoro can use Haki. We know Zoro's a strong guy. But with his back against the wall and in multiple scenes, he relies on something else to boost his power. That being his soul power, right? Soul power of Asura, the ability to change his own soul's breath, its rhythm, its frequency. And this didn't really come from nowhere. In fact, we start to see this more and more after the time skip, after he trained with Mihawk, Perona, and the Humandrils. So let's talk about that next. So Mihawk did train Zoro during the time skip, but what does that have to do with this extra power system? Well, kind of everything if you just look at the different scenes that Mihawk's in. But first, let's take a look at some of the symbolism that we see when we were first introduced to him in the Baratie arc after he just got done bullying Don Krieg. Now, there's a lot of pieces of symbolism here with Mihawk that represent death, right? He sails in on this coffin-shaped boat. His boat is adorned with these green ghost flame candles, almost kind of like a seance. He's also dressed up wearing this old gothic attire. He's got a cross around his neck, which, maybe that's for like warding demons or something like that. Maybe that's why it looks different from Zoro's. We don't really know that yet. And his sword is also kind of shaped like a cross. And the last piece of evidence here that we learn is that his name is Dracul, much like Dracula, who, if you know anything about vampires, they're undead, right? They're in between life and death. Much like when Zoro taps into his breath of all things abilities, he's usually between life and death, at least in the very beginning. What do all these observations even mean? Isn't Oda just trying to create an edgy-looking character design? Well, I don't believe so, and in Marineford, that isn't so. You see, in the scene where Luffy is running through the carnage, Mihawk scopes him out, showing off his double iris eyes, and as an aside, I believe this might just be observation Haki for now. We don't really know. But anyway, I'll address Mihawk's and every other double iris character's eyes in my next video, as they can absolutely be explained by my theory. But here we see Mihawk let loose energy waves that many would explain as Haki. And while it's entirely possible that Mihawk used Haki here too, what I want you to notice is the color of that attack. It's the same as the green ghost flame candles on his boat, and the same green as Brook's Soul King. So take a look at this short clip here where we can see this green energy travel up his sword and dissipate. It looks very different from Haki, doesn't it? Well, if you're still unconvinced, check out this scene where Buggy is pulled into the fight by Luffy and used as a meat shield, which Mihawk dices up immediately. If Mihawk was using Haki here, then shouldn't this have killed Buggy? It seems to me that since Mihawk didn't use Haki, and since Buggy isn't a Logia user, that Buggy may have taken some damage here, but not physically. And because his body gained an exception to taking damage from cutting attacks from his devil fruit. Later on in the fight, though, we see that Mihawk releases a massive energy wave when he tries to kill Luffy. And that energy wave then goes to cut one of the frozen tidal waves and almost seems to discharge this Conquerors-like energy that gives everyone the feeling of what it's like to be close to death, which can be seen by the shock on their faces. And that last part's kind of just speculation, as this could just be that they're surprised by how overpowered Mihawk is. But nonetheless, it's fun to think about, right? So let's wrap this all up. The purpose of this video was to use our favorite Marimo and his edgelord master as overt examples of the soul power system. We learned that everything has its own soul, and that a given individual can learn to see and manipulate these souls as well as their own. We also learned that with this soul manipulation technique, it can be used to attack another person's soul directly, and that an individual can manipulate their own soul to mimic that of, say, a demon god, or overlay that demon god's soul over their own, giving them a substantial power boost that seems to vary based on how close that person is to death, or how well they can enter this near-death state with experience or talent. These observations tell us a lot about the rules of soul power and give us a glimpse of what Zoro could potentially look like in future fights thanks to Mihawk, and that Mihawk most likely has that same ability to channel a demon god or something like that, but to a higher degree, making him a problem for people like Shanks. And for my next video, I'm going to be covering the double iris eyes that a lot of characters display. I'm going to explain how a character gains these eyes and what we know these eyes do so far, and what we could see in the coming chapters involving these eyes in the final saga. But thanks again for watching, guys. This is my first YouTube video ever. It was pretty fun to make. But anyways, be easy, and I'll see you next time.